I'll just add one thing to that. Mike, you and I have talked about an excellent article on the Church and the State by Karl Barth.
Which we're
One thing
going to
I'm
get together, which we are going to get together
so
and
excited. I
do a
want to talk
show
about
on
that.
that.
We got a lot
Yes.
of stuff to say about that now, don't we?
That's going to be a couple hours
That's be
there.
good. Yeah. But one thing that I really appreciate, I didn't know much about Bart until I was well into my 30s. I was working in a small institution that had a seminary, and they happened to have one of the premier Bart scholars teaching there. So I was like, well, I'm going to go take this guy's class. Boy, was that a good class! One of the best I've ever had. Um, it was quite interesting to me to learn from Burnett's class on Bart that the German church, for the most part, Bonhoeffer and some exceptions, pretty much rolled up to Hitler and said, "High five, man! Those traditional values, man, that's awesome. We are with you 100%." And Bart stood back and said, "What are you doing? This man does not speak the word of Christ. He does not belong to our creeds. He does not believe our faith. There is nothing this party is doing that looks anything like the gospel. What are you doing?" They're all up there putting on their red armbands. I think that there is such a temptation to power. Um, Uniquely, I think at the moment, the American church is facing that temptation very strongly, and I don't know that all of it is reacting well. Because I think political power is extremely tempting. Because when we have power, we feel like we have safety. And then we feel like we can sit in our little safe houses and do what we want, and everybody's cool, and we're the majority. We got top guard. It's our prayers that get said at the football games. Um, it's our commandments that are on the walls in Louisiana. I think Mike, you're asking a really interesting question there, and I agree with you, Cliff. That's a whole show to really dig into the fact that, and I'm sure this is true for all our other nations, but I live in this one. In America, we very much confound our Americanism and our religion, and we swirl them together into one thing. That's an interesting question. I've not thought about that in conjunction with gender norms, though I would argue that America's not, I've said it, I don't think America's doing a super great job with gender norms. Women went backwards in board positions and CEO positions this past year. We've seen pretty much a across all fronts retreat of diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives. I would argue that we needed those initiatives because we're nowhere near parity at any spot, on any metric, anywhere in any American institution for parity, for racial parity and representation, for gender parity and representation, for socioeconomic. I can go down the list and look at lots of different businesses, organizations, whatever. It is rare to find an institution where you truly have what looks like equality. Those movements were going in good directions, and now they're under fire because they've become a political football and a culture war. That's a whole other show.
Hmm.
It'll be interesting to see how well the American church.
I was kind of hoping that the election turned out differently just for that cause,
You and me both, man.
just for that cause. Because I won't talk about my political viewpoints, but I thought to myself, if Trump doesn't win, then the church is going to actually have to step up and be the church.
Find
Uh,
an identity outside of
Outside of,
like
again, the
the things that have been popular.
Christian nationalism that has now taken over biblical Christianity in the last maybe 12 years, well, 8 years at least here.
40.
Well, yeah, yeah. If we go back to 1980, yeah, you're darn right. We could go all the way back there. But if we're to look at the massive,
Deep
like,
roots, man.
yeah, it's got deep roots, but I'll tell you, the tree has branched very much in the last 8 years than it had really prior to that. I mean, you had it in your Reagan, it seemed to be a shoot with a few branches, and then you had your Bushes where it kind of branched a little bit, but it just seems once we hit 2020, it just exploded. Now we have all these branches going everywhere that seem to have forgotten where the root is at. But so
Yeah, I
it's
think
out. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think it's interesting, when you look at truth is always going to be revealed. I mean, truth is truth, whether I claim to be a Christian or I claim to be a whatever. And even if I'm an atheist, the reality is truth is still going to resound when it's actually experienced. And I think that the danger is we like to stay as close to the truth where we actually feel like we're prospering. Yet in our sinful nature as human beings, we also want to also stay on the other side of the fence and be able to reach over, pick the fruit when we want to eat it, and enjoy those things, right? And so for us, when we tie our nationalism, when we tie our patriotic values to the fact that I can stand as a Christian and still do this and I'm justified in it, or it's good for more the majority over the minority, whatever, however you want to argue it. That's where it gets really dangerous, because for us as Christians, I mean, I can say, I can look at my wife, and my wife and I, we have 7 kiddos, biologically ours. We have the picture of a family that's quite different than the majority of the people in the United States. My wife is a stay-at-home mom who is a teacher through her education, as well as she was public school, private school. She's taught online. She's homeschooled. Yet she enjoys that role of motherhood from the 3-year-old, almost 3-year-old that we have, all the way through our 21-year-old. And so it's very easy for people to assume that there's this, like, well, that must be the way in which he believes, that the wife stays at home, barefoot, pregnant, my poor wife, and then I do these things. And yet that really isn't the truth. The truth of the matter is that we both, as husband and wife, believe we actually have become one, and the fact that we utilize our gifts together for the blessing of our family. Now, there's norms that most people would say, well, as a man, maybe you should be doing the finances. Now, that's changed a lot in our culture over the last couple decades. Now, plenty of women do run the finances in their home, but you go back a few decades, that wouldn't have been the case, right? And so even in our homes, we've gotten smart enough to realize my wife should be doing the finances. My wife should be doing the education of the children. My wife, like, there's roles that have been experienced. But I think that only as we as people, when it comes to gender, when it comes to race, when it comes to all that, realizing that as the bride of Christ, one body, many parts, that's when we actually shine. And the problem is, we all like to have, if I'm a thumb, I like a bunch of thumbs in the room. And so let's just kick them back over to their country because they don't look or sound like me. And I'd rather be around people that look like me. I know that's simplifying it to an extreme, but I think that sometimes we just have to simplify it to a point where it's like, how do I explain to my 3-year-old? And then let's get beyond that,
And it comes back to the reality of what we started with. The whole idea of women not having a voice in ministry, so to speak, or feeling like second-class citizens because the good old boys just want to surround themselves by a bunch of good old boys, and they want to pull a scripture or two and hover that over somebody's head when they're not even sticking to the loyalty of the text, just to do what they want to do. So, I mean, I think that kind of, we talk about that, it's kind of like we've come completely encircled from where we started. So the question, and I think we've come up with some really good ideas of how do we bridge the divide with this, because it is challenging. I loved what that Tennessee church is doing. In fact, I'd love to try to get a hold of those people and have them on the show and say, what are you doing? Because if it's working, we need to do this. We need to incorporate more models like that. So what can we do at this point in American Christianity that will bridge this divide that exists between men feeling that they have the authority to preach the gospel and women do not? Where do we bridge that? I mean, we've talked about a few things, but if we were to just kind of recap, what do we do? And how do we move forward? Because really, this is a sensitive topic. Like I said, my wife, when she says, I've listened to John MacArthur and others, and I just feel like from the comments they make, I have no value. And my wife's called to do ministry. But she feels like I have no value because this is how it's portrayed, and they use scripture to back it up. But as David Scholer proved that, yeah, that's great. They use one or two pieces of scripture, but they're missing the other 35.